What's up, everybody? This is Captain bringing you another Path of Exile guide, this one on my Perforate Gladiator in the 3.7 Legion League. It's been a really fun build to play, and in terms of defense and single target damage output, it is probably the most powerful character I have ever played in this game. So, segueing right into that, as stated, the single target damage is fantastic. If you have not tried Perforate, I would say it's the main strength of the skill. I experimented with some of the various newer skills and just really came to enjoy the heavily juiced up single target damage output, especially because of all the extra life that magic and rare enemies got in this patch. So single target damage is excellent. I can kill defense modded Shaper Guardians within the windows of my temporary buffs. Just over a 2-minute Uber Elder. Very, very competent in terms of clearing endgame bosses. The area of effect of the skill is definitely a bit weaker, though I wouldn't say it feels bad or anything like that. The actual AoE of the skill is, I would say, mediocre, but is made up for by the fact that the build is incredibly mobile and thus can jump between sections of really large packs or between packs very, very easily. And so I think that the mobility of the build makes up for it, but I would say that it's not the strong point of the way that I have the build set up. You probably would need to include corpse explosions or something like that to really get the AoE feeling like a tier 1 skill. So with that said, the mobility of the build is fantastic. You get tons of attack and movement speed both, and because we run shield charge, which scales off both of those stats, you really can zoom around maps very quickly, and because we also just run very quickly, maps with kind of poor layouts are not a huge issue either. And probably the biggest strength of this build is its defense. Its defensive package is very robust, and you just don't die unless you misplay against like endgame bosses or something like that. Probably the biggest weakness is damage over time, but even that, isn't a huge issue, and we have a decent amount of chaos resist, so at least that form of damage over time isn't terribly scary. But endgame, like the Uber Elder ground degen and stuff like that can be a little bit of a pain in your side. But really, for the most part, nothing scares you, and it's incredibly tanky against all of the Legion content. You can just face tank any set of Legion rares on any set of map mods in the game, pretty much. As well, none of the bosses are scary at all. You just face tank everything. It is incredibly powerful, though I will say that it does rely on some temporary buff management to maximize the defensive prowess of the build, which leads us into the last part to discuss, which is that there is a good amount of buff management, both offensive and defensive, or sort of combination effects. So Dread Banner and Berserk offer combination offensive and defensive benefits, and Veil War Chief for a purely offensive benefit, the Blood and Sand stance swapping for single target versus AoE modes, and then finally we have Molten Shell, which is the purely defensive steroid, which is very powerful, and then the last thing on our skill bar is just shield charge and our main skill. So everything on the skill bar is an active skill, and if you don't like to deal with a lot of active skills, then you may not like this build. But I don't find it to be obnoxious, but I am a bit biased because I do tend to like builds that are very active in terms of their playstyle. So, without further ado, let's go into the details of the build. Let's jump into a discussion of the gear on my Perforate Gladiator. We'll start with the unique items. We have here the Surrender Shield, with the most important or unique stat on it being the level 30 Reckoning. With the change in Legion 3.7, all the flat fizz that is given to Reckoning makes this hit really hard in combination with the Gladiator Ascendancy's double damage from counterattacks. So that's a big part of why I'm running it, but it also gives a ton of armor, which we do a lot of scaling of, and the life recovery on block is great, though you can get a bit more of that on a rare Elder Shield, and it just has good block chance. Has everything we need. Nice life as well. Next is the Impresence Amulet. This is what we chose to get our Vulnerability Curse. There are other options for that, but since we are a pure physical damage build, you probably want to run Vulnerability unless you want to run a Defensive Curse, which I don't think we need. We have plenty of survivability, and so more damage is the choice that I went with. And all the stats on this are useful to us. Even the stun and block recovery, since we don't have true stun immunity, we only are immune to stun when we block, is more valuable than you might think. Next is Belt of the Deceiver, which I am using to get the 2 unique stats on it, which are the reduced extra damage from crits, which I think helps kind of plug up a weakness of this build, which is that it doesn't take single hits as hard, at least when it doesn't have its temporary steroids up. It is more survivable anyway against large strings of small to moderate sized hits, and nearby enemies are intimidated, is a solid boost to damage. I got the percent increased maximum life corruption implicit just for a little bit of extra life to close the gap between what you can get with this and like a rare Stygian with a jewel or leather belt. Then we have our rings here, which pretty much just are life resists and any other damage stats you can muster, like flat fizz, accuracy, stats. Base stats are nice. But we needed to have an open prefix for the -9 to total mana cost of skills. Getting the -9 craft on this meant we got our perforate to exactly 0 cost, which feels really, really nice, and allowed us to use up our mana for reservations significantly more. That, in combination with the minus total mana cost of socketed attacks on your chest, the Delve mod, are what got our attack skill down to 0 cost. Supported by level 1 Maim is an awesome damage boost, since it's kind of another half a link. And then if you can get plus crit chance to attacks, that's awesome, but that's just a whole order of magnitude more expensive, and I didn't want to pay that much. So anyway, life and percent life is another nice hybrid mod that you can get on this with fossils. And then you want to leave ideally an open prefix so you can craft this, which I have, which is chance to block attack damage, or you could craft percent life and mana, or flat life and armor are also reasonable. The helmet here, nearby enemies take percent increased physical damage, is what you're looking for. The life and percent life hybrid mod from Delve Fossils is also great if you can manage. This is a helmet I crafted myself. And then any other stats that are useful, those are the really notable ones that you can get here. As far as the craft goes, plus level of socketed AoE gems and percent increased area of effect hybrid mod is good. You can also craft that on your gloves though. So we threw accuracy here to cap our accuracy. For gloves, it's just kind of your standard glove stats, life resists, and then either attack speed or flat physical damage. There's some cool stuff you can get on like Elder Shaper gloves, but really not necessary. And then we left a prefix open here for +1 level of socketed AoE gems, increased AoE. Like I mentioned, you can craft on your helmet, since we do have multiple gems that can benefit from that. And then boots, they're just, again, kind of generic stats plus movement speed is really it. And as far as the enchants go, the attack and cast speed one is probably best. I just haven't bothered to try and change this since I got my skills down to 0 cost. And in terms of glove enchants, there's really nothing that changes the build significantly. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but Commandment of Fury is nice, Spite is nice. Commandment of Light, I think it's called, the one that drops Consecrated Ground, is also okay when you get crit. And then finally we have our weapon. I think a Corsair sword is kind of the ideal base. Nice high attack speed, benefits from the flat physical damage boosts we get on gear and from our rage support on our main skill. And just feels really nice and has the percent increased global accuracy rating implicit, which I think is ideal because it let us cap our accuracy most easily compared to other options. You could go for a foil if you wanted, but foils are more expensive, first of all, by practically an order of magnitude, and they really don't offer that much more damage. I think the main advantage you're going to get from those is the extra weapon range if you're like a Cyclone build, but for our purposes, I like the Corsair sword. The other thing is getting the dex necessary to run a foil would mean that you'd have to sacrifice some stats elsewhere, but if you really want to try and make that work, I'm sure that it's doable. Finally, we have our flasks. Blood of the Karui is what I chose for the life flask, just because it's kind of the fattest life flask you can get, aside from the one that recovers your life and then gives you a chaos degen, Forbidden Taste. But I like this guy better. And then we have, among our flasks, utility flasks, sulfur, diamond, granite, quicksilver. You want to make sure you have your immunities spread across them for bleeding, freeze and chill, and curses. It doesn't really matter which ones they're on, except that the sulfur flask has more uses than the other flasks, and therefore the one that is most important for you to make yourself immune to, you would stick here. Probably I should have the freeze and chill or bleed immunity here. I just haven't bothered moving it around because it hasn't felt necessary. But sulfur is great because it's increased damage, and the regen, even though it's a really small patch of consecrated ground it gives you, is relevant because you can face tank stuff during that window while your temporary buffs are up, and so you just kind of get another nice temporary defensive steroid. Diamond Flask, you run it when you do crit builds unless you have nearly 100% crit or almost no crit, but for the vast majority, Diamond Flask is so much damage. And then Granite, you could run a Lion's Roar here, but I don't recommend it. It feels absolutely awful when you're in Blood Stance because it hits so quickly that it pushes things out of the tiny Blood Stance AoE and just feels awful and actually just reduces your DPS against a single target in kind of a real combat scenario. But Granite is the best in my opinion because we scale armor a lot and use Molten Shell. And then Quicksilver, anybody who's seen my guides knows that I love Quicksilver flasks, and this is a shield charge build, so it actually does scale our movement ability as well. Next, let's talk about the skill rollout for the Perforate Gladiator. So first, our main skill here is Perforate. The links we chose to support it are Close Combat, Brutality, Multi-Strike, Rage, and Impale. Close Combat is just a lot of damage, and the utility it offers for jumping around between packs or sections of a really large pack is really valuable, especially because the AoE on this build isn't huge, but you kind of make up for it by being incredibly mobile, and this really supports that playstyle. Brutality, pure physical damage build, just so much damage, gotta run that. Multi-Strike is something that I found smooths out the clear on this build pretty significantly because it's a Nova and it goes out in a certain pattern. If you're always hitting the ground in the same spot, there are sometimes kind of dead spots where stuff doesn't die since we're not running anything like Herald of Ash or Corpse Explosion effects or anything, and so the slight changes in where you hit on the ground with Multi-Strike kind of clear out those dead spots in your area of effect around you. And also it just synergizes nicely for ramping up Impale on like rare enemies and stuff like that. Rage is a really, really high damage support for us once Rage gets stacked up, and also just supports the sort of very mobile playstyle that we have by giving attack and movement speed, which both scale shield charge. Also, it allows us to run Berserk, which I think is an awesome steroid, which gives us both offensive and defensive benefits. And then finally, Impale, we are using Dread Banner, we are pure physical damage, and so this support not only offers a lot of damage, but offers us utility in gaining banner stacks more quickly and allowing us to have our juiced up Fortify more often. Next we have our secondary damage skill, so Reckoning, which is provided by the Surrender Shield, supported by Brutality, Melee Physical Damage, and Impale, these are just basically the highest damage supports that there are, and man, this thing hits way harder than you would expect it to for something that is kind of only a 4 link, but really more like a 5 or 6 link due to the ascendancy and shield that we're running. Then we have our movement skill Shield Charge linked to Fortify and faster attacks here, pretty standard. And then we also jammed Veil Ancestral War Chief in these links with that, so it gets a little damage boost from these supports, because why not? Even though it's not super important. Then we have Berserk, as I referenced before, awesome offensive and defensive steroid. You don't want to use it more than a couple times a map because you have to build up your rage again, but it is great for, you know, packs of 10 Legion rares or just to zerg down a boss at the end or whatever. And then we have a couple of triggered skills linked to cast when damage taken. We have Tempest Shield just to give us a little extra block chance, and then Blood Rage. This is providing us with the only source of leech that we have, but it also gives attack speed and frenzy charges, which are great as well. And then we have our reservation skills. So we have Vulnerability linked to Blasphemy, which is free from this amulet. We have Blood and Sand, which allows the stance swapping, which Perforate synergizes with. It has secondary modes for, or alternate modes for each stance, so you really want to have that. We have Precision here, which is just helping us cap our accuracy and gives us some crit. Pride, you want to run this on pure physical damage builds if you can. It's just a lot of damage. And Dread Banner here, which again is a nice package of both offensive and defensive benefits, giving Impale Chance, Impale Effect, and then a nice Fortify steroid when you get enough stacks, which we accumulate pretty quickly due to the nature of Perforate, especially in Blood Stance. And then finally we have Molten Shell, which is our last active skill. We have a lot of armor, so we get, you know, an extra 7,000 health or so when all our temporary armor buffs and things are up, and then we pop this. So we get a lot of benefit out of us. It basically doubles our health pool during that time. Finally, a couple things to note. You know, because of the juiced up Dread Banner effect, I do actually run it on my skill bar. A lot of people don't. But I like getting the Fortify boost, so I can just sit there and face tank a Shaper Slam or whatever. I also like casting Molten Shell myself in response to big slam attacks again, like boss, wind-up attacks, or before jumping into a pack of Legion rares or whatever, as opposed to putting it on a trigger, but you could definitely do that if you wanted. And then I only run the Veil version of the totem here, just because I found it more of a hindrance to try and drop the totem in just normal combat scenarios, just a regular totem, than a help. And the Veil totem, is really useful against tougher fights where the little bit of time invested in dropping it actually does feel worth it. Alright, so here's the passive tree for my Perforate Gladiator. Since we are invested fully in block, we have gone up and invested these 6 points into the ascendancy section of the passive tree, just giving us a whole bunch of block, spell block, some partial stun immunity, bonus damage on block, and all kinds of different effects like that. Really, these are just the standard points that you're going to invest if you're going to make a full block build, which is what we did. And then we just threw Arena Challenger on top of that, the new couple of points that were added this league, and the damage and mobility steroid that this provides is pretty awesome, feels really great, and is going to spoil you. If you haven't played with it yet, I highly recommend you make some build that takes advantage of this. So next, one of the most important stats we're looking for is block. And so all the points that we have invested that provide block here and here, here and here are all the places that we get it. and a lot of them also provide damage, this point also giving us some endurance charge generation, which is actually enough to just keep endurance charges up during general mapping, though you won't have them during boss fights. And as well, just talking about our defensive package, we are pretty invested in armor as well. We have the points in Soul of Steel, which offer other bonuses. We have these points here into the armor and guard skills. We have this point right here, which gives some armor. These provide us with some armor, and these provide us with some armor as well. We do get some armor from our fortifying nodes as well. I guess it's just these guys right here that give armor also. These are probably some of the more debatable points. You could definitely throw these points somewhere else if you really wanted to. Like you could put a point here into Unwavering Stance, which I haven't felt the need to throw a point into this. But anyway, I have really liked having better uptime on Molten Shell. It is noticeable, and as well, because of the Timeless Jewel that I have here, it also boosts our Fortify a little bit. And then we also have our Fortify nodes, which these are kind of combo nodes. These provide more damage, and these provide other defenses in the form of armor. And because we run Dread Banner, and then also get some Fortify effect, where is it? Here and here from our Timeless Jewel, we have a pretty beefy Fortify when it's up, and we really can tank some pretty massive hits. We also have points in crit on the offensive side here, here, and here. We are a crit build. We're not heavily invested into crit, but it gives us a pretty nice boost to our damage. It's something like doubles our damage. And we also have some points in Impale. We were running these points earlier, but because we're now running the Impale support and we have Dread Banner, we're at 92% chance to Impale without having to spend a travel point to go down here and get this. There's better defensive options up along this path for our particular build. So this is the route that I chose to go. These are great points, and you could definitely, swap these here and then, figure out how to get a couple extra points, or if you were to level further than I am at 97 and want to make it happen somehow, they're totally solid points. But the way that the tree is now, you just have to pass by points that are good, like these, because there's other stuff that you feel is better, or plugs holes in your build. We have a little bit of AoE right here. I think these nodes are fantastic. They kind of just cover your AoE needs for the most part. If you can get more, that's great, but it feels pretty decent just having at least this boost right here. We have some accuracy here and here, and then these nodes also provide base stats that we need, as well as the reduction in mana cost of skills, which let us hit that perfect 0 cost perforate, so that's why I have that extra 1 point spent right here, but you could get that on a jewel or something also if you wanted. And then aside from that, we basically have life nodes and regular damage nodes, and then we'll talk about the jewels here. So we have a Watcher's Eye. Since we are running both Pride and Precision, a Watcher's Eye jewel that provides bonuses based on either one is totally fine. The one I have here is a pretty expensive one. It is actually a drop that I found from killing Uber Elder, but you could also run the one that gives chance to inflict double damage from Pride. You could run the Precision one that gives up to 50 crit multi. You could use the utility Flask one from Precision that gives you charges on crit. That would be pretty great. And then there's some other just generic damage bonuses that if you got them in a good enough combination would still be solid choices, especially since Watcher's Eyes always have life on them. So I think this is the one that's going to give, just for a single stat, the most damage, though. It ends up being something like 20% more damage with the level of investment that we have into Impale. I ended up choosing a Lethal Pride jewel here. You could experiment a lot with these different Timeless jewels. but I just decided to go with one that gives, nice little bonuses that I think just end up being better than a random jewel here. Essentially, we get 20% increased effect to fortify, we get crit chance, we get life, we get melee damage, and then I think it's stun threshold here. So, it's hard to beat those stats on just a regular jewel, but maybe if you have an insane enough jewel, then you could do that instead, and you could also experiment with sticking the jewel up here, because you do go through a decent number of notables in this area as well, but I don't think quite as many as here. And then the last jewel that we're running here is one that gives us a chance to gain onslaught on kill, since we don't have any other source of onslaught on our build. And this is enough to just keep it up during general mapping. And this is actually a jewel that I found, so I just stuck it in there and stayed with it. And just to come back and mention one more thing, Unwavering Stance is a point you could definitely take. We don't have true stun immunity, but we're pretty darn close to true stun immunity, and with the bit of stun and block recovery that we have from our Impresence amulet, it just hasn't felt necessary to throw this point in. I would consider moving it around if I've, died to stun chains or something like that, but it just doesn't happen. So I haven't bothered, and you do get a tiny little bit of evade chance when you drop your banner, so I'd rather have that than stun immunity, which I don't think would prevent any deaths on this character. But you may disagree and may want to go with this, and if you're playing hardcore, then you might want to throw that point in here and just drop one life node or whatever it is somewhere, because true stun immunity is really, really valuable in that particular environment.